The day Virginia Prescott buried her father, 3 different men in suits came to her door before the dirt had even settled properly over his grave, each one wearing the same hungry expression beneath their polished hats, each one telling her the same quiet, practiced lie, that the 40 acres her father had spent his whole life on was nothing but cracked earth and broken dreams, and she ought to sell it before the sun finished the job of killing everything that remained. Virginia stood on the porch of the small timber and adobe house her father had built with his own 2 hands in the summer of 1871, just outside the dusty town of Cibola Flats in the New Mexico Territory, and she looked out at the land that stretched toward the distant red mesas, and she thought about the way her father used to press his palm flat against the earth and say he could feel something underneath it, something that breathed, something patient. She had been 24 years old that autumn of 1878, and she had nowhere else to go, and she had nothing to sell except this parcel of hard ground that everybody in 3 counties seemed desperate to convince her had no value. The first man was Gerald Hatch, who ran the Cibola Land and Cattle Company out of a fine office on the main street of town. He was 50 or thereabouts, with wide sideburns and a habit of resting his thumbs in his vest pockets when he talked, as though the gesture lent him authority. He offered her $200 for the property and called it a generous sum given the circumstances. When Virginia told him she was not selling, he tilted his head slightly and said she would reconsider in time, the way a man says something when he already knows the outcome and is simply waiting for events to confirm it. The second man was a rancher named Clifton Boyle who ran cattle about 6 miles to the north, a red-faced man who sweated through his collar even in October and spoke too loudly for enclosed spaces. He told Virginia the land would never support cattle because there was no reliable water source anywhere on it, that her father had scratched around for a well for years without finding one, and that the summer heat would bake her alive before spring. He offered her $180, less than Hatch, and seemed to believe this was a reasonable negotiation. The third was a lawyer from Santa Fe, whose name Virginia did not bother to remember, because the moment he referred to her father as the late, unfortunate Mr. Prescott, something in her went cold and decided, and she told him good afternoon before he had finished his second sentence. She went back inside and sat at the small pine table where her father used to eat his supper and look out the eastern window at the land he loved, and she allowed herself to cry for a little while, because she had not done it yet at the funeral, having been too occupied with arrangements and the small courtesies required of grief. She cried until the light through the window turned amber, and then she stopped, because Virginia Prescott had never been a woman who indulged sorrow longer than it was useful. Her father, Thomas Prescott, had come to the New Mexico Territory in 1869 from Missouri with a wagon, a mule, a young wife named Clara, and a conviction that the land out west held something for a man willing to work for it. Clara had died in the winter of 1872, taken by a fever that moved through the territory with terrible efficiency that year, and Thomas had raised Virginia alone after that, teaching her to read from the Bible and from whatever books he could acquire at the trading post, teaching her to shoot a rifle with the same matter-of-fact practicality with which he taught her to keep the stove burning and the larder stocked. He had tried for a well 3 times on different parts of the property. The first attempt had gone down 40 feet before the sides collapsed. The second had produced only damp clay at 60 feet before he ran out of money to continue. The third time he had brought in a man from Albuquerque who claimed to know the terrain, and that man had taken his money and left without producing anything useful. Thomas had grown older and the land had stayed dry, and the neighbors and the merchants in town had looked at his 40 acres the way people look at a dog that is clearly never going to recover, with a certain practiced kindness that was really just a form of contempt. Virginia had grown up on that land and she loved it without fully understanding why, the way you love the people who shaped you, not because they were perfect, but because they were yours. The red mesas in the distance changed color at different hours of the day, rose and gold in the morning, deep ochre and purple at dusk. And the sky above the territory was a blue so complete and so uninterrupted that it felt like a different sky than the one over ordinary places. There were hawks that hunted along the ridge a quarter-mile east, and in the early spring there were flowers in colors Virginia had never seen in any book, stubborn, vivid little things that pushed up through the cracked caliche as though daring the earth to stop them. She had $8 and some change remaining after the funeral expenses. She had a rifle, a pistol, a mule named Augustus who was 17 years old and moving toward his final years with distinguished slowness, the timber and adobe house, the 40 acres of ground everyone kept telling her was worthless, and a hard-headedness that was, as Thomas Prescott used to say with equal parts exasperation and pride, her most reliable inheritance. She decided she would give herself until spring to find a solution. If she could get through the winter, something would present itself. She had always believed, in a practical rather than a religious way, that problems had solutions as long as you stayed alive long enough to find them. The first week of November brought the man with the dowsing rod. Virginia was outside mending the fence line along the northern edge of the property when she saw him coming down the road from the direction of town, a tall figure on a roan horse the color of autumn leaves, moving at a relaxed pace that suggested he was either in no particular hurry or had already arrived at whatever conclusion he was heading toward. As he drew closer, she could see he was a young man, perhaps 27 or 28 by the look of him, lean but broad-shouldered in a canvas duster the color of dust, wearing a hat that had seen real weather and boots that had covered real ground. He had a rifle in a scabbard on the left side of the saddle and a bedroll strapped behind, and tied across the top of the bedroll, incongruously, was what appeared to be a forked length of peach wood about 18 inches long. He stopped the horse at the fence where Virginia was working and touched the brim of his hat. "Afternoon," he said. His voice was unhurried, with a slight resonance to it, the kind of voice that sounded like it was accustomed to open spaces. "I am looking for the Prescott property." "You found it," Virginia said, not putting down the fencing pliers. "I am Virginia Prescott. What is your business?" He swung down from the horse in one easy motion, landing with a quiet certainty, and held out his hand across the fence. "Henry Turner. I am a water finder by trade and a surveyor when the occasion calls for it. I heard in town that this land has been having trouble with water, and I would like to speak with you about it if you are willing." Virginia looked at his hand and then at his face. He had dark brown eyes that were direct without being aggressive, a jaw that suggested stubbornness, and a 3-day growth of beard that was not so much negligence as it was the natural result of living outdoors. He looked honest, which was not the same as being honest, but it was a starting point. "Who sent you?" she said. "Nobody sent me," he said. "I came on my own account. I was in Cibola Flats for the night, and I heard several people in the saloon talking about the Prescott land, most of them saying it was worthless desert and due to be sold for practically nothing. Something about the way they said it made me curious. Men who want land as badly as those men seem to want it generally have a reason that goes beyond sentiment." Virginia found this interesting enough that she put the pliers down in the fence post hole and looked at him more carefully. "What is that piece of wood on your bedroll?" she said. He reached back and untied it with a familiarity that suggested the action was as ordinary to him as checking a cinch strap. He held it up. It was a forked branch, smoothed with use, the kind of peach or willow wood that dowsers had been using for generations. "Dowsing rod," he said. "Before you tell me it is superstition, let me say only that I have found water with it 14 times in 5 years across 3 territories, and that I do not fully understand why it works, but I have observed that it does in the right hands and in the right ground." "My father tried everything," Virginia said. 3 wells and none of them produced." "I know," Henry Turner said. "I asked around a little." Your father dug in 3 locations, 2 in the northern section and 1 near the house. I would like to walk the whole property before I make any assessment." He paused, and there was something direct and respectful in the way he held his ground without pushing. "I am not asking for money, Miss Prescott. If I find nothing, you owe me nothing. If I find something and it proves viable, we can discuss terms then." Virginia was quiet for a moment. The wind came down from the north and moved across the flat ground, carrying the smell of dry grass and something colder underneath it, the first real suggestion of winter approaching. She thought about the 3 men in suits. She thought about her $8 and some change. She thought about the way her father used to press his palm against the earth. "I will give you an hour," she said, and went to open the gate. Henry Turner walked every inch of the 40 acres that afternoon, and Virginia walked with him, partly because it was her property and she had a right to observe what happened on it, and partly because she was watching him with the careful attention she gave to things that might matter. He moved slowly and methodically, the forked rod held loosely in both hands with his palms facing upward and his thumbs turned outward in the classic grip, his head slightly down, his eyes relaxed. He talked as he walked, not to fill silence, but because he seemed to think explaining himself was part of the courtesy he owed her. He told her he had grown up in Central Texas, son of a farm family, and had learned the rudiments of water finding from a Mexican ranch hand named Esteban who had been doing it for 40 years, and who claimed to have learned from his grandfather, who had learned from someone before him. A chain of knowledge passing hand to hand down through generations in a country where water was the difference between life and death. Henry had gone west after the war, not the Great War, but a smaller and more personal war with circumstances that had left his family's land in someone else's possession, and had found that the skill Esteban had taught him was in demand in dry country. "I do not claim to be a miracle worker," he said, as they crossed the southeastern corner of the property near the base of a long, gentle slope that ran toward the mesas. "I claim only to be observant. The land tells you things if you pay attention. The way the vegetation clusters, even the sparsest vegetation, the way the ground lies, the presence of certain stones." He stopped walking, the forked rod in his hands dipped. Not dramatically, not in the manner of theatrical performance, but steadily and with a certain inexorable quality, the tip of the fork bending downward against the natural tension of the wood, the 2 prongs pressing into his palms as though something below was pulling at it. Virginia watched his face. He was not performing. His expression was concentrated, almost inward, like a man listening for a distant sound. "Walk with me," he said quietly. He moved 10 feet to the left. The rod leveled. He moved back and it dipped again, and this time it dipped lower, the wood twisting in his grip with enough force that his knuckles whitened. He moved another 5 feet south, and the rod pulled down so sharply that he had to press back against it to keep the branch from wrenching itself horizontal. "Here," he said. Virginia looked at the ground. It was caliche and hardpan, pale and indifferent, with a few scrubby plants she did not know the name of growing in a cluster about 8 feet away, unremarkable in every visible respect. "How deep?" she said. "I cannot be certain," he said. "The strength of the pull suggests it is not 100 feet. It feels closer." He released the rod and let it spring back upright, and he knelt down and pressed his palm against the earth in a gesture so similar to her father's habitual motion that Virginia felt something move in her chest, some recognition that was almost painful. He held his hand against the ground for a long moment. Then he looked up at her, and his dark eyes were direct and unhurried and certain. "Miss Prescott, there is water under this ground. Not a trickle. Something more significant. I believe your neighbors know it, and I believe that is why they want your land." Virginia stood in the long November light and looked at the ground and looked at the man and made a decision that was partly about the water and partly about something she could not yet name, something that had to do with the way he had pressed his palm against the earth. "You had better come inside," she said. "I will put coffee on." The kitchen of the Prescott house was small and scrubbed clean, with a cast-iron stove and a pine table and 4 chairs, and a shelf of books that surprised Henry Turner enough that he paused when he saw it, his hat already off in his hands, and looked at the titles before he caught himself doing it. "My father believed that reading was the one thing you could not take from a person," Virginia said, setting the coffee pot on the stove. "He was right," Henry said. He sat down at the table with the careful courtesy of a man who is conscious of being in someone else's space and wants to be respectful of it. He turned his hat in his hands once and set it on the table beside him. His dark hair was slightly flattened from the hat, and he ran a hand through it absently. "I am sorry for your loss, Miss Prescott. I heard he passed only recently." "3 weeks ago," Virginia said. "Heart, the doctor said, though I think it was more a case of carrying too much for too long." She said it without particular bitterness, as a simple statement of what she believed to be true. Henry was quiet for a moment in the way that genuine sympathy is quiet, not filling the space with inadequate words but simply acknowledging the weight of it. Then he said, "Tell me about the 3 wells." She told him, and he listened with the full quality of attention that was already proving to be one of his most distinctive characteristics, asking occasional precise questions, the exact location of each attempt, the depth reached, the soil profile encountered, whether any moisture had been found at all. She answered as precisely as she could, drawing on memory, and on the rough notes her father had kept in a small ledger that she retrieved from the shelf and handed across the table. Henry read through the ledger carefully, and she watched him read, and she noticed that he read with genuine engagement, turning back to recheck a detail, pausing to think. His hands were broad and capable and bore the evidence of real-work calluses at the base of each finger, a healed cut along the back of the left hand, stains that were probably from soil and certainly not from ink. "Your father was not wrong in his instinct," Henry said finally, closing the ledger gently. "He was wrong in his location, and I suspect the first man he hired from Albuquerque knew it. The geology in this part of the territory runs in a very particular way. There is an aquifer, a substantial one, that runs roughly northeast to southwest. The 3 locations your father tried are all on the wrong side of a subsurface ridge. The water is sitting just on the other side of it, deep enough to have required a more careful approach but not so deep as to be impossible." He looked up. "The spot I found today is on the correct side of that ridge. I am confident of it." The coffee was ready and Virginia poured it into 2 tin cups and set one in front of him and kept one for herself and sat down across the table. The lamp on the shelf behind him cast warm light across the room, and the November wind pressed against the window glass, and the fire in the stove made its small sounds of heat. "What do you want, Mr. Turner?" Virginia said, not unkindly, but with the direct plainness of a woman who had learned that clarity was a form of self-preservation. Henry Turner looked at his coffee cup and then at her. "Right now I want to help you," he said. "I have a brother in Santa Fe who knows a drilling outfit that owes him a favor. I believe I can get them here within the month to put a proper well down at the location I found. If it produces what I think it will, your land is not worthless desert. It is potentially the most valuable water source in this county, given that the summer of 1877 dried up half the existing wells between here and the river." "And what do you ask in return?" she said. "A fair percentage of any future income from the water rights, if you choose to develop them. Or a straight payment when the well is producing, if you prefer. I am not particular about the arrangement, and I am not in a position to demand anything, since I have not yet delivered anything. I would rather prove myself useful and negotiate from that position." He paused. "But to answer the full spirit of your question, Miss Prescott, I am not like the men in suits who came to your door. I have no interest in taking your land. I have a great deal of interest in proving that it is worth keeping." Virginia studied him across the table in the lamplight. Outside, the wind continued its commentary on the November desert. The fire crackled. Augustus, the mule, made a sound from the direction of the small shed at the back. "You may stay in the shed tonight if you do not mind the company of a very old and dignified mule," Virginia said. "And tomorrow you may walk the property again with your peach wood, and we will discuss the arrangement further." Henry Turner smiled for the first time, and it was a good smile, the kind that involved his whole face rather than just the lower part of it, and it was directed at her with a warmth that was uncomplicated and entirely genuine. "That suits me perfectly," he said. He stayed 2 nights in the shed with Augustus, and on the 3rd morning he rode to Santa Fe to speak with his brother, and Virginia was surprised by how quiet the property felt after his horse disappeared down the road toward town, a quiet that was different from the ordinary silence she was accustomed to, more like the particular silence of a room after a good conversation has ended. She told herself this was simply the natural consequence of having had company for the first time in 3 weeks. She kept herself occupied. She repaired the second section of fence line, cleaned and oiled the rifle, spent an afternoon going through her father's papers with the systematic thoroughness that grief sometimes produces, a need to account for every corner of the person who is gone. She found, among his papers, a letter he had started writing and never finished, addressed to no one in particular, that began, "The land is not empty just because you cannot see what is in it. Some things take patience and a willingness to believe before the evidence confirms you." She read it twice and folded it carefully and kept it. She also went into Cibola Flats to replenish her supplies and cash in the small amount her father had kept in the Cibola savings and loan, which proved to be $43, more than she had expected, enough to see her comfortably through the winter if she was careful. Gerald Hatch saw her on the main street and came out of his office with the practiced friendliness of a man who has not yet abandoned a plan, telling her the offer still stood, that he was a patient man, that she should not let pride prevent her from making a sensible decision. Virginia thanked him for his concern in a tone that conveyed the opposite and went on to the general store. The proprietor of the general store was a stout, cheerful woman named Mrs. Adeline Rowley, who had been in the territory almost as long as Virginia's father had, and who served as the unofficial repository of every piece of practical information in a 40-mile radius. She was measuring out cornmeal when Virginia came in, and she looked up with the warm efficiency she brought to everything. "I heard someone was out walking your land yesterday with a dowsing rod," Mrs. Rowley said, because news of any kind moved through Cibola Flats at the speed of gossip, which was faster than the post. "Word travels," Virginia said. "Gerald Hatch was in here this morning asking about it," Mrs. Rowley said, in the tone she reserved for information she considered important. "He was not pleased, asked if I knew who the young man was." She looked at Virginia with bright, interested eyes. "Did he find anything?" "He believes so," Virginia said carefully. Mrs. Rowley set the cornmeal down and leaned on the counter with both hands in a way that meant she was about to say something significant. "Virginia, I am going to tell you something your father told me once, in confidence, because I think you need to hear it now. Thomas told me, about 4 years ago, that he had spoken to an old Navajo man who had lived in this area his whole life. And that man told him there was a spring-fed water table under the southeastern corner of that property that the old people had known about for generations. The man called it something in his language that Thomas said translated roughly as the hidden belly of the earth. Thomas never found it because he always dug in the wrong places, and then he ran out of money and then out of time." She paused. "Gerald Hatch knows about that conversation. Thomas told him about it years ago when they were still on speaking terms. That is why Hatch wants your land." Virginia stood very still in the middle of the general store with the smell of tobacco and leather and dried goods around her, and she felt something settle into place with a click she could almost hear. "Thank you, Mrs. Rowley," she said. "You are welcome," Mrs. Rowley said, and went back to the cornmeal. "That young man with the dowsing rod, he had kind eyes. I saw him in town 2 evenings ago." "He did," Virginia said, and did not say more, because she had just enough self-awareness to recognize the slight warmth that came with saying it. Henry Turner returned to the property on the 14th of November, and he did not come alone. Riding with him were two men, his brother James, who was older by 5 years and shared Henry's directness without his younger brother's particular quality of patient attention, and a Mexican drilling contractor named Señor Rafael Domings, who ran a small but capable operation, and who had, as Henry had promised, an outstanding professional debt to James that he was willing to settle in labor. They arrived with a wagon carrying a hand-operated drill rig of the kind that had been developed in the previous decade, heavy equipment that required real muscle to operate, but was capable of reaching depths that a simple hand-dug well could not approach. Virginia stood on the porch and watched them come down the road in the afternoon light, and she felt the first real hope she had allowed herself since her father's funeral, a tentative and private thing that she was careful not to display. Henry rode ahead of the wagon and pulled up at the gate and touched his hat. "Miss Prescott, I hope we have not kept you waiting too long." 14 days, she said. "I have been managing." He swung down and opened the gate himself to let the wagon through, and as he held the gate he looked at her with those direct dark eyes and said quietly, "I thought about this property the whole ride back. I think about it more than is probably professional." She was not entirely sure in the moment whether he meant the property or something about the property that included her. She chose to take it at face value for the time being and invited them all in for coffee. They began drilling the following morning. The location was the southeastern corner where the dowsing rod had dipped and where Henry was most confident, and the work was loud and slow and required all 3 men working in rotation, driving the drill bit down through the caliche and sandstone by the incremental logic of repetition and muscle. Virginia brought out food and coffee and water at regular intervals, not because anyone had asked her to, but because it was her property and her neighbors, and she was not a woman who stood by watching work be done without contributing to it. On the second day of drilling, at a depth of 53 feet, the drill hit what Domings described with professional pleasure as the best kind of obstruction, a layer of saturated sandstone, which meant water. By the time they had pushed through another 8 feet, water was flowing up the casing pipe with a pressure that surprised even Domings, who had been doing this work for 20 years. Virginia stood at the edge of the drill site and watched the water come up out of her father's ground and flow across the pale caliche earth, and she pressed her hand flat against the wet ground the way her father used to press his hand against the dry earth. And she said something under her breath that was not quite a prayer and not quite a statement, but existed somewhere between the two. Henry Turner was standing a few feet away, his jacket off and his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, streaked with dust and grinning with a wholehearted satisfaction that was entirely infectious. He looked at her kneeling by the flowing water, and his expression changed from satisfaction to something quieter and more attentive. He came and crouched down beside her. "There it is," he said. "There it is," she agreed. They stayed crouched side by side for a moment in the November sunshine with the water flowing between them, and Virginia was acutely conscious of his shoulder 2 inches from hers and the warm smell of outdoor work that came off him and the uncomplicated happiness in his voice. And she thought, this is a dangerous moment, not in the way of danger, but in the way of something that matters, a moment that will look significant in retrospect. She stood up and straightened her skirt and said, "We need to begin setting the casing properly. I want it done right." And Henry Turner stood up beside her, still smiling, and said, "Yes, ma'am," in a way that managed to be respectful and affectionate simultaneously. James Turner proved to be a practical and likable man who treated Virginia with the straightforward respect of someone who has encountered competence and recognizes it. And Señor Domings proved to be not only a skilled contractor, but a storyteller of rare gifts who kept the evenings at the long outdoor fire, entertaining with accounts of drilling operations across the Southwest that were by turns improbable and amusing and occasionally instructive. They stayed 10 days in total, completing the well casing and setting a proper hand pump that would stand solid use for many years. And when they departed, Virginia paid Dowsing from her own pocket for the materials, a sum she could just manage, and agreed with Henry on a fair arrangement for his labor, a modest percentage of any income from water rights, to be paid when, and if that income materialized, an agreement they wrote down on 2 sheets of paper and both signed. The night before James and Dowsing left, the 4 of them sat around the fire outside and shared a bottle of whiskey that James had produced from somewhere in the wagon, and Dowsing played a guitar he had been carrying since their arrival, and the music went up into the cold, clear desert night with its billions of stars and its particular territorial silence. And Virginia sat across the fire from Henry, and they looked at each other across the flames with a directness that they had both been careful about until that evening, the whiskey and the music and the completed work having lowered the usual careful distances by several degrees. "You going to stay in the area?" James asked his brother with the casual precision of a brother who already knows the answer. "For a while," Henry said, without looking away from Virginia. "There is still work to be done." James made a sound that was half acknowledgment and half amusement, and Dowsing played something quiet and beautiful on the guitar, and the fire burned down in the cold air. And later, when the others had gone to their respective sleeping arrangements, Henry and Virginia stood for a moment at the edge of the light before parting for the night. "The well needs to be tested properly over the next weeks," Henry said. "The pressure, the volume. I should stay within reach." "There is still the shed," Virginia said. "Augustus has become accustomed to the company." "Only Augustus," Henry said, and the slight smile at the edge of his voice was understated but unmistakable. Virginia looked at him steadily. She was not a woman who played games with language or with herself. "No," she said simply, "not only Augustus." Henry looked at her in the firelight with an expression of complete, careful attention, as though she was something he wanted very much not to misread. "Miss Prescott," he began. "Virginia," she said, "I think we have moved past the formality." "Virginia," he said. And the way he said it, as though it was the name of something he had been looking for and had just now located, made her look away briefly at the fire and then back at him, because she was not quite ready to let him see the full extent of what she was feeling, not yet, not while it was still so new. "Good night, Henry Turner," she said. "Good night, Virginia Prescott," he said. Over the following weeks, Henry stayed. He was not idle. He helped Virginia with the fence lines and with the repair of the shed roof, and with a dozen other small projects that a property the size of theirs accumulated. And he was methodical and good at physical work in the way of someone who has never been able to afford to be otherwise. And they worked alongside each other with a natural ease that seemed to have been arrived at without the usual friction of 2 people learning the rhythms of shared space. They talked. This was the part that Virginia had not anticipated. Not the water, not the physical proximity of working together, but the conversations that seemed to rise naturally between them in the way that conversations between well-matched people do, not requiring effort or manufacture, simply emerging. He told her about Texas, about the farm before the war and the farm after, about Esteban and the Dowsing, about the years between Texas and New Mexico that had involved more of the territory's rougher geography than he particularly liked to dwell on. She told him about growing up on the 40 acres with her father, about reading everything she could find, about the territory and its particular quality of beauty that she had loved all her life without ever being able to adequately explain it to anyone who had not seen it. He had read many of the same books on her father's shelf, which delighted her. He had opinions about them, strong, considered opinions that sometimes agreed with hers and sometimes did not, and the disagreements were as pleasurable as the agreements, because he argued with the seriousness of someone who cares about the subject rather than about winning. He told her about a book of geological surveys he had read in the library in Santa Fe that had confirmed, in the technical language of science, everything the dowsing rod had suggested about the aquifer beneath her land. She found this combination, the practical mysticism of the rod alongside the rigorous satisfaction he took in the science that explained it, characteristic and endearing. News of the successful well reached Cibola Flats within 3 days of the water flowing, because in small communities events of significance do not remain private for long. Mrs. Rowley told Virginia when she came in for supplies that Gerald Hatch had been seen in his office with the door closed for an unusually long time after the news arrived, which was Mrs. Rowley's way of communicating that the man was regrouping, and that Virginia should be prepared for a renewed approach. The renewed approach came in December, this time from a lawyer Virginia had not seen before, sent from Santa Fe with a different offer, $500, which was a significant increase, and suggested that Hatch had done some additional calculation about what the water was worth. Virginia read the letter at the kitchen table with Henry standing near the stove, and when she had finished she handed it to him without a word. He read it and set it down. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want to keep my land," she said. "I have always wanted to keep my land." "Good," he said. "Then we need to establish the water rights formally. Your father may not have done this, and if the rights are not clearly registered with the Territorial Land Office, Hatch may try to claim them through some other mechanism." He looked at the letter again. "I know a land attorney in Santa Fe who is both competent and honest, which is a rarer combination than it should be. I would like to write to him today." "Write to him," Virginia said. He wrote the letter that afternoon at the kitchen table, drafting it twice for precision, and she sat across from him reading and watched him work with the concentration he brought to everything, his pen moving steadily across the paper, and she thought about the fact that he had said, "We need to establish the water rights," with complete naturalness, as though her concerns had already become his concerns without any formal agreement that this should be so, and she found this less alarming than she might have expected. 2 weeks before Christmas, the water from Virginia's well was tested again by a man Henry brought out from town, a retired engineer named Fowler who had worked on water systems in Denver before retiring to a quieter life in the territory. Fowler measured the pressure and the volume and the quality of the water with a professional thoroughness that Henry watched with arms folded and an expression of focused interest, and then Fowler made his assessment. It was, Fowler said, a very fine source, consistent, high pressure, clean water from a deep aquifer that showed no indication of seasonal variation. In his professional opinion, with proper infrastructure, this source could supply not only the Prescott property, but could realistically provide water rights to 2 or 3 neighboring ranches and potentially, if a proper distribution system were constructed, to the outskirts of Cibola Flats itself, where the existing water supply was unreliable in dry years. Henry turned to Virginia and said nothing, because nothing was necessary. Virginia thanked Fowler and paid him his consultation fee, and then stood at the window of her father's house, looking out at the southeastern corner of the property, where the pump handle stood in the pale winter light, and she pressed her hand against the cold glass in the same gesture her father had used against the warm ground, and she felt the weight of something completed, something that had been carried a long time and could now be set down. She heard Henry come and stand behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold room, and then his hands came to rest on her shoulders carefully with the same quality of patient certainty with which he had held the dowsing rod. "Your father was right," he said softly. "He always knew it was here." "He did," she said. She turned because the moment required it, and he was very close, and his dark eyes in the winter light were full of something that she recognized because she had been watching it accumulate over the weeks with the same attention she gave to everything that mattered. "Henry," she said. "Virginia," he said. And because they were both people who said what they meant and meant what they said, and because there was no useful purpose served by continuing to treat the obvious as though it was uncertain. He kissed her, not tentatively, but with the directness that was his nature, one hand coming up to her jaw, and she kissed him back with the same directness that was hers. And the winter light filled the room around them, and the fire in the stove made its small sounds. And the 40 acres of ground that everybody had called worthless stretched out in every direction around the house like a kingdom that had been waiting, patient underground, to be recognized. They were standing in the kitchen when he pulled back and looked at her and said, with an expression that was both serious and slightly undone, "I should tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "I came out this way because of the wells," he said. "That part was true, but I also stayed because of you. I want to be honest with you about that because I do not think it is fair to let you believe the two things were in different proportions than they were. By the end of the second day of walking your land, the well was still the professional purpose, but you were already the personal one." Virginia looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I know. I have known for some time." "Was it that obvious?" he said. "To me," she said. "I pay close attention to things." He laughed, which was a sound she had already decided she liked, enormously low and warm and surprised into honesty. "Yes," he said, "you certainly do." January brought the formal response from Henry's land attorney contact in Santa Fe, a thorough letter that laid out the steps required to register the water rights with the Territorial Land Office, and confirmed that the rights, having originated with the original land patent held by Thomas Prescott and now inherited by Virginia, were defensible. The attorney, a Mr. Elias Whitfield, advised them to file immediately, before any competing claim could be made, and offered to handle the necessary paperwork from his end for a reasonable fee. Virginia wrote back the same day. Henry rode into Cibola Flats to send the letter by post, and while he was there, Gerald Hatch appeared at his shoulder outside the post office with the practiced casualness of a man who has been watching for the right moment. "Mr. Turner," Hatch said. He was still affable, still thumb in vest pockets, but there was something less relaxed in his eyes than there had been earlier in the autumn, a tightening around them that suggested recalculation. "I hear you have been busy out at the Prescott place." "Moderately so," Henry said, and continued sealing the envelope. "That is good agricultural land," Hatch said, "and the well is certainly a development. But the young lady ought to understand that running a water business in this territory requires capital and connections she may not have. I am prepared to be very generous. $1,000, and she keeps a small parcel near the house for her own use." Henry turned and looked at Hatch with the precise, direct attention he gave to things that required clarity. "Mr. Hatch," he said, "Miss Prescott is filing water rights with the Territorial Land Office this week. Her land is her own and her water is her own, and she is not selling either of them. I would recommend you stop sending intermediaries and making offers, because it is wasting everyone's time, including yours." Hatch studied him for a moment with those tightened eyes. "You have a stake in this," he said, and it was not a question. "I have a professional arrangement," Henry said, "and a personal interest in seeing that a good woman is treated with the fairness she is owed." He put the letter in the postmaster's hand. "Good day, Mr. Hatch." He told Virginia about the conversation that evening, and she listened with the still expression she wore when she was integrating something into her understanding of a situation. When he had finished, she said, "He will not stop." "Probably not immediately," Henry agreed. "But once the water rights are registered, his options narrow considerably." "It is not just the water rights," Virginia said. She had been thinking about this since the autumn, turning it around in the methodical way she thought about problems. Even with the rights registered, a man like Hatch with money and lawyers can make the legal process expensive enough that I cannot sustain it. I have limited resources and he has more." Henry was quiet for a moment. He had his elbows on the table and his hands together in front of him, looking at the tabletop, and Virginia watched the quality of his thinking, the way he went inward rather than immediately producing speech, which was one of the things she had come to trust about him. "There is something we have not discussed," he said, raising his eyes to hers. "And I want to be clear about what it is, because I do not want you to misunderstand my intention." He reached into his jacket and produced something that Virginia, in the moment, took to be another letter, but which was, on closer inspection, a small piece of paper folded around something small and hard. He set it on the table between them. "I have been carrying this around for 3 weeks," he said, trying to find the moment that did not make it seem as though I was proposing a business transaction, because that is not what this is. What this is that I am 28 years old and I have been in love with you since approximately the 4th afternoon I spent on this property, and I have been a reasonably competent finder of things that are hidden, and I have never found anything I did not want to keep more than I want to keep being near you." Virginia looked at the folded paper on the table, and then at Henry Turner's face, which was showing, for the first time since she had met him, the particular kind of vulnerable that a person shows when they have said the most important thing they know how to say, and are waiting to find out if it is also the most important thing the other person has been thinking. "Open it," he said. She unfolded the paper. Inside was a ring, not an elaborate or expensive thing, but a simple band of silver set with a piece of turquoise the color of the New Mexico sky, bought, she would later learn, from a Navajo silversmith in Cibola Flats, and it was beautiful in the way that simple, precise things are beautiful, things made with care for a specific purpose. "Virginia Prescott," Henry said, "I would very much like to marry you if you will have me. And I want you to understand that I am asking because of who you are, and not because of what your land is worth, though your land is worth a great deal, and I am very proud that I helped prove it. Those are 2 separate things, and they should be kept separate." Virginia looked at the ring and looked at the man and thought about everything that had happened since the November afternoon when he had come down the road on his roan horse with a dowsing rod on his bedroll. She thought about her father pressing his hand against the earth and believing in something he could not see. She thought about the water that had come up out of the ground with its pressure and its clean, cold certainty. "Yes," she said. "I will have you, Henry Turner." He exhaled in a way that told her he had been holding his breath, which she found entirely endearing, and he reached across the table and took her hand and slid the turquoise ring onto her finger, and it fit, which seemed right, and he held her hand in both of his for a moment the way he held the dowsing rod, with care, with certainty, with the patient confidence of someone who has found what they were looking for. They were married in the first week of March of 1879 in the small church in Cibola Flats, a simple ceremony performed by the minister, attended by James Turner, who had ridden down from Santa Fe for the occasion, and by Mrs. Rowley, who cried with cheerful conviction throughout the proceedings and afterwards pressed Virginia's hands and told her she was doing exactly the right thing, a piece of information Virginia had not required, but received with affection. The water rights were formally registered with the Territorial Land Office at the end of February, just before the wedding, and the document arrived signed and sealed the week after. Virginia kept it with her father's letter, the unfinished one about patience and belief, in a tin box on the shelf beside the books, 2 pieces of paper that together told the whole story of the 40 acres and what it had taken to keep it. Gerald Hatch made one more attempt after the water rights were registered, this time through his lawyer, who filed a competing claim alleging that the original Prescott land patent had an error in the survey description that invalidated the boundary on the southeastern corner, which was precisely the corner where the well stood. This was a not uncommon maneuver in territorial land disputes, and Henry's attorney Whitfield had specifically anticipated it. The counterargument was filed within 2 weeks, supported by a new survey of the property conducted by a territorial land surveyor, who measured every boundary with the precision of someone who knew his work would be challenged and intended to be unassailable. The territorial land judge dismissed Hatch's claim in April, noting in his ruling that the survey evidence was clear and that the original patent was valid. Hatch did not appeal. Perhaps he calculated that the cost of further litigation exceeded the probable return. Or perhaps he simply recognized, as men sometimes do when the evidence has accumulated sufficiently against them, that a particular battle was finished. Virginia was sitting on the porch when Henry came back from town with the news of the ruling, riding the roan horse at a slightly faster pace than his usual unhurried trot, and she could tell from the distance what the news was by the way he was sitting in the saddle, and she was already smiling when he pulled up at the fence. "It is over," he said. "I know," she said. "I can see it on your face." He swung down and tied the horse and came up the porch steps and put his hands on either side of her face in the late afternoon light and kissed her forehead and then her mouth. And she put her arms around his neck and held on, not with the desperation of relief, but with the steady certainty of someone who has done a difficult thing and come out the other side of it intact. Spring arrived in its extraordinary New Mexico fashion, sudden and complete, the desert floor coming alive with the kind of color that seems impossible after the severity of winter. The 40 acres, which had spent decades looking like 40 acres of nothing in particular, revealed itself to be something else entirely once the water table was established, and the first irrigation channels Henry and Virginia dug together began to carry water to the corners of the property. Grass grew. Not the thick domestic grass of well-watered farmland back east, but the native grasses of the territory, the ones that belonged to this particular earth, resilient and various and full of their own beauty. Henry, who had the practical intelligence of a man who thinks constantly about what the ground can do, had been corresponding with his brother James about the possibility of a modest cattle operation. Not a large one, not the ambitious kind that required capital they did not have, but a small working herd that could be watered from the well and pastured on the improved grass. James knew a rancher in the Pecos Valley who was selling a small herd of mixed cattle at a reasonable price, and in May Henry and James rode down to look at them and came back with 18 head and a plan. The plan was sensible and incrementally ambitious, which was the right kind of ambitious for their circumstances. The water rights arrangement that Henry had negotiated included a modest annual payment from 2 neighboring ranches that had begun piping water from the Prescott well across agreed easements. Not enough to make anyone wealthy, but enough to provide a reliable income that supplemented the cattle operation, and meant Virginia did not have to worry about the winter supplies with the same edge of anxiety she had carried through the previous year. By summer of 1879, the Prescott property, which had begun to be known in the surrounding area as the Turner Ranch, though Virginia kept her father's name on the deed alongside Henry's, was a functioning enterprise. Small, certainly. Modest by any ambitious standard, but alive and solvent and getting incrementally more productive, which was the correct direction. Henry had been corresponding with a man in Albuquerque who ran a cartography and survey firm, and who, it turned out, had known of Henry's reputation for water finding for some years, and wanted to discuss a professional arrangement that would allow Henry to continue taking survey and water finding work across the territory on a contracted basis. This seemed ideal. It would bring in additional income during the seasons when his presence on the ranch was less critical, and it made use of a skill that was genuinely valuable in the territory's particular geology. Virginia had mixed feelings about the time away this would require and said so directly, because that was how she operated. Henry listened and said he had been thinking about the same concern, and proposed that the contracted work be limited to the period between late fall and early spring, when the ranch needed less intensive labor, and that he would not take any contract that kept him away longer than 3 weeks at a stretch. Virginia considered this and said it was acceptable, and they shook hands over it at the kitchen table in the same way they had shaken hands over the original water rights arrangement, which made Henry laugh and Virginia smile in the way she did when something was both funny and real at the same time. By the autumn of 1879, Virginia discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Henry in the evening after supper, in the manner she approached all important information directly, without preamble. He was cleaning his rifle at the table when she sat down across from him and said, "I am going to have a baby. In the spring, I expect." He set the rifle down and looked at her for a moment with an expression that moved through several things quickly: surprise, which was immediately absorbed by a joy so complete and clean that it was among the most uncomplicated things Virginia had ever seen on a human face. He got up from his chair and came around the table and took her hands and pulled her up and held her, not dramatically, not in the manner of theatrical performance, but with a quiet intensity that said everything words were not going to improve. "A spring baby," he said, into her hair. "Your father would have been glad." "Yes," she said, "he would." She felt him press a kiss against the top of her head, the gesture of a man who is being careful with something precious. And she stood in the circle of his arms in the kitchen of her father's house and felt the continuity of things, the land beneath them, the water moving underground in its patient ancient way, the child that was coming, the life that was accumulating around them day by day with the solid incremental certainty of something built to last. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was a hard one in the territory, cold and dry, with a series of storms in January that drove snow across the mesas and kept men close to their fires for days at a time. Henry did not take any contracted survey work that winter, partly because of the conditions and partly because he was not willing to be away from the ranch when Virginia was 7 months and then 8 months into the pregnancy, a decision she did not argue with, though she told him clearly that she was perfectly capable of managing on her own and did not require nursemaiding. "I know you do not require it," he said. "I want to be here. Those are different things." "They are different things," she agreed. He spent the winter months on the property, working on the stable he had been planning since the summer, a proper timber structure to replace the old shed that Augustus, in his 19th year of dignified existence, deserved a somewhat better version of, and on the fence lines, and on the irrigation plans for the spring. And in the evenings he read to Virginia from the books on the shelf when her eyes were tired from the lamplight, and they talked in the long winter evenings about everything and nothing. The kind of talk that happens between people who are genuinely interested in each other's minds and have the luxury of time to follow a thought wherever it leads. He read her the chapter on New Mexico geology from the survey book he had gotten in Santa Fe, pointing out the passages that corresponded to what the dowsing rod had told him about the southeastern corner in November of the previous year. And Virginia asked precise questions, and he answered them with equal precision. And the evening went on past the usual hour, and they let the fire burn down a little and neither of them minded. He told her about Texas again, more than he had before, about the specific landscape of it, the different quality of the light there, the particular sound of the wind across the central plains. He had not been back since leaving, and she could hear in the way he described it that the loss of it was a real thing, not dramatic but present, a scar that had healed over without disappearing. She told him about Missouri, which she could not remember except from her father's descriptions, an imagined place that had always seemed to her both familiar and foreign, the place her family had come from but not the place she was made of. "You are made of this," Henry said, meaning the territory, the 40 acres, the red mesas in the distance and the sky and the stubborn spring flowers. "I could see it the first afternoon I walked the property. The land knows its own people." "You believe that," she said. It was not quite a question. "I believe it the way I believe in the dowsing rod," he said. "Not because I can explain the mechanism, but because I have observed the evidence." Their son was born on the 6th of April, 1880, in the bedroom of the timber and adobe house, delivered by a midwife named Mrs. Cardona from Cibola Flats, who had attended dozens of births in the territory, and who moved through the process with the calm authority of someone who has seen everything and is alarmed by nothing. He was a healthy boy with a full voice and dark eyes that looked, in those first days, as though they might not be sure what they were going to be, though they settled in the end into the same warm brown as his father's. Henry held his son for the first time standing at the window of the bedroom, looking out at the southeastern corner of the property in the early April morning light, and his face was doing the thing it did when he was feeling something very large going very still, the way a man goes still when he is trying to contain something that is too large for ordinary expression. "Thomas," Virginia said, from the bed. It was a statement and a question simultaneously. Henry turned from the window and looked at her. "Thomas," he said. "Yes, Thomas Henry Turner, if that is all right with you." "Thomas Henry Turner," she said. "That is exactly right." The boy grew in the way of children who are well-fed and much attended quickly, with a decided personality that established itself early and made its preferences known without reservation. He had his father's directness and his mother's observational intensity in a combination that produced a child who was, as Mrs. Rowley put it when she came to call in the boy's first summer, going to be either a great deal of trouble or a great deal of achievement, and quite possibly both, in sequence. Henry had taken up his survey and water-finding contracts by the summer of Thomas's first year, riding out in the fall and returning within the agreed 3 weeks, always bringing back something for Virginia from wherever he had been, a book from an Albuquerque bookshop, a particular kind of cured tobacco for a pipe she had acquired, once a carefully wrapped piece of geode crystal that had cracked open in his hands while he was surveying a canyon wall, and revealed its interior of purple amethyst, which he said had seemed too much like something she would like to leave behind. She kept the geode on the shelf beside the tin box with the land documents and her father's unfinished letter. The ranch grew steadily over the following years. The small herd of 18 cattle became 30, and then 45 by 1882, a sustainable working number for the size of the property. Henry built a proper corral and expanded the stable, and installed a second pump on the western end of the property for the cattle, a job he and a hired hand named Cruz, a young man from one of the village families to the south, who proved to be both a capable worker and excellent company, completed in the late summer of 1881. Virginia managed the water rights arrangements with a precision that Elias Whitfield, the Santa Fe attorney, told Henry was better than the documentation he had seen from most ranches 3 times the size of theirs. She kept meticulous records of the payments from the neighboring ranches, maintained the easement agreements, and had developed, by 1882, a clear proposal for a more formal water cooperative that would allow 3 neighboring properties to share infrastructure costs while maintaining their individual rights, an idea she had written out in a 12-page document that she showed Henry one evening with the careful casualness of someone presenting something they care about but do not want to appear anxious over. He read the whole 12 pages without interrupting. Then he said, "Send this to Whitfield." "You think it is workable," she said. "I think it is better than workable," he said. "I think it is exactly what this part of the territory needs, and I think you should be the one to present it to the neighboring ranches, not me." She looked at him. "They may not take it as seriously coming from a woman," she said. This was not complaint but plain observation. "Then they are wrong," Henry said simply, "and they will figure that out when the proposal demonstrates itself to be correct, which it will." The proposal went forward in the spring of 1882, presented by Virginia at a meeting of the neighboring ranchers in the back room of the Cibola Flats General Store, Mrs. Rowley having made the space available and provided coffee, which was characteristic of her. The meeting was attended by 5 ranchers and their representatives, and Virginia stood at the front of the room and presented her water cooperative proposal with the same clarity and precision with which she did everything, answering questions with patience and accuracy, and declining to be flustered by the one rancher. A man named Pete, who had taken Gerald Hatch's place as the most obstructive person in the county's land affairs, who asked with unconcealed condescension whether she had had assistance writing the proposal. "I wrote it," Virginia said. "My husband reviewed it. He thought it was good. You should take that as a recommendation, given his record in this area." There was a small appreciative sound from the back of the room where Henry was sitting, which he converted quickly into a cough. The proposal was adopted by 3 of the 5 ranches, which was enough to make it viable, and Pete came around within a year when the economics became impossible to argue with. By 1883, the Turner Ranch, 40 acres plus the additional 20 that Henry had purchased with 3 years of contracted earnings from the survey work, adjacent to the original Prescott land on the northern boundary, was a going concern of the kind that Thomas Prescott had spent his working life trying to build. It was not a large or spectacular operation. It was a good, solid, self-sustaining piece of New Mexico territory, with reliable water and a working cattle herd, and a house that had been expanded once to accommodate an additional room and a proper covered porch. And it sat in the shadow of the red mesas under that impossible sky, with the quality of a place that has been understood and cared for properly. Virginia was pregnant again by the spring of 1883, which she told Henry on the same matter-of-fact basis as she had told him the first time, though this time he was not cleaning his rifle but mending harness leather at the kitchen table, and he looked up from the harness with the same complete clean joy as before, which she had anticipated and which still, despite the anticipation, made something warm move through her chest. "Thomas is going to have an opinion about this," she said. Thomas, who was 3 years old and in possession of an extremely formed personality, had opinions about most things. "Thomas's opinions are generally worth hearing," Henry said. "He wanted a horse last week," Virginia said. "Before he wanted a horse, he wanted to know why the sky is blue, and before that he wanted to know why Augustus is old." "What did you tell him about Augustus?" Henry said. "I told him that Augustus had been doing important work for a very long time and had earned his rest," Virginia said. Augustus, who was 22 years old in 1883, and moving with the slow dignity of a very elderly gentleman, had in fact largely retired from active service the previous year, living out his days in the new stable with a thoroughness that suggested he had been planning this retirement for some time. Thomas adored him with a complete and solemn devotion that everyone on the property found deeply touching. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1883, and named Clara for Virginia's mother, which seemed right. A name carried forward from the woman who had made the crossing to the territory, and not survived it long enough to see it become what it could be. Clara Turner arrived with the same decisive health as her brother and a look about her, even in infancy, of someone who has already figured out where they are and are deciding what to do about it. Thomas, informed of his sister's arrival, studied Clara for a long, serious moment, and then announced that she was acceptable, which Henry and Virginia both took as high praise given the critical standards of the judge. The years that followed were the years of building, in the quiet and unspectacular sense, the sense of people who have found their place and are working it with the full capacity of their attention. Henry took fewer contracted survey trips as the ranch required more of his time and provided more of its own income, though he maintained his professional relationship with the Albuquerque cartography firm on a selective basis, taking the jobs that genuinely interested him and declining the ones that would require too much time away. Virginia expanded the water cooperative, which by 1885 included 7 properties and a more formal organizational structure, and had developed a reputation in the county for both the cooperative itself and for the negotiating intelligence behind it that meant she was occasionally consulted on other land and water disputes as an informal authority, a role she accepted when asked, and did not seek when not. The ranch gained a reputation of its own in those years, not for size or dramatic wealth, but for a quality of operation that more experienced cattlemen noticed and respected. Henry had a particular aptitude for reading terrain and range condition that complemented his water-finding skill, and the cattle on the Turner land were consistently better conditioned than herds on comparable range, because the water was reliable and the pasture rotation was managed with care. Cruz had stayed on as a permanent hired hand and had brought his younger brother Mateo the following year, and both of them had become as integral to the daily operation as Henry himself. And the arrangement worked because Henry understood that good work deserved real respect and real wages, and he operated accordingly. There were difficulties, as there are always difficulties. The winter of 1884 was brutal enough to cost them 9 head of cattle and an entire season's hay supply, requiring them to purchase feed at high prices that cut deep into the year's earnings. Henry's left arm was broken in the spring of 1885 when a gate swung unexpectedly while he was moving a bull, an injury that healed well but took 3 months and limited his work significantly during the repair of the irrigation channels. A prairie fire in the late summer of 1885 came within a mile of the property before changing direction with the wind, a night they all spent on the roof with wet burlap and buckets, watching the orange horizon with a combination of readiness and helpless waiting that stripped the usual protections of competence away and left the primal fact of the territory's power very clear. But they came through each difficulty with the property and the people intact, and each difficulty, survived, became part of the texture of a life that was genuinely theirs, earned rather than given. Thomas, at 5 and then 6 and 7, showed a clear aptitude for the land, not specifically for cattle, which he found interesting but not absorbing, but for the geological and hydrological qualities of it, asking questions about the water table and the rocks with the intensity of someone in whom Henry recognized, with a private delight that he mentioned to Virginia quietly one evening, the same orientation toward the hidden things that the ground contained that had made him a water finder. He brought the boy out with the dowsing rod one Saturday morning in the fall of 1886 when Thomas was 6, and let him hold it in the proper grip over the known location of the well, and Thomas felt the pull immediately and went very still with his eyes wide, and then looked up at his father with an expression of absolute astonishment. "It knows," Thomas said. "It knows," Henry confirmed. Virginia, watching from the porch with Clara on her hip, saw the two of them standing together in the southeastern corner of the property with the dowsing rod between them, 2 heads of dark hair tilted at the same angle of concentration, and she felt the emotion of it move through her with such force that she had to press her free hand against the porch post for a moment and simply let it be. Clara, unimpressed by the water finding, was more interested in the cattle and in the horses and in the general mechanical workings of the operation, and by the time she was 3, she had attempted to climb into the corral on at least 4 occasions and had been prevented each time with increasing difficulty, as she was developing both determination and strategy. By 4, she could already tell the difference between the 2 horses' temperaments at 50 yards, which Cruz declared was better judgment than some adults he had known. In the spring of 1887, Virginia walked the full perimeter of the original 40 acres one afternoon alone, in the way she sometimes did, not as an inspection but as a private communication with the land, the kind of attention she had been giving it since childhood. She walked the fence lines and the irrigation channels and stood for a long time at the southeastern corner by the pump, and she thought about the November afternoon in 1878 when she had stood in nearly this same spot and watched a man with a dowsing rod kneel down and press his palm against the ground with a certainty she had not yet allowed herself to share. 9 years. She was 33 years old. The land was alive under her feet in a way it had never been when she was a child, fed by its own water, managed by people who understood it. The house had an additional room and a covered porch, and a kitchen garden that produced green things from April through October. The stable sheltered 4 horses and 1 ancient mule who was 26 years old and still eating well and clearly planning to outlast everyone's expectations. 2 children were alive and healthy and growing into people of genuine interest. The man she had married was somewhere on the north pasture checking the fence line and would come back at supper time with dirt on his hands and something to say about whatever the ground had told him today. The injustice of what her father had endured, the years of grinding work without the water that would have made it possible, the men who had known what lay beneath the ground and chosen to let an honest man fail rather than share what they knew was not something Virginia had ever fully released. She had thought about it with more clarity as the years went on rather than less, understanding as she understood more about the territory and the land business that her father's case was not unusual, but was in fact the common story of small independent landholders who stood between wealthy speculators and resources the speculators wanted. Thomas Prescott had never been given a fair chance, not by the information that was withheld from him, not by the neighbors who offered his grieving daughter insultingly low prices within days of his funeral. She had resolved this injury in the only way that seemed adequate to it, by keeping the land, by proving its worth, by building on it something that lasted. It was not justice in any formal sense, but it was the conversion of what had been taken into something that could not be taken, and that was the closest approximation of justice available to her. She heard hoofbeats from the direction of the north pasture and turned to see Henry coming back early, not at a trot, but at a faster pace that suggested he had decided, for some reason, to come back and find her. He pulled up beside the pump and swung down, and she looked up at him in the afternoon light with his hat pushed back and the easy way he moved that she had watched for 9 years and still found worth watching. "I saw you walking the perimeter," he said. "Thought I would come see what you were thinking." "Many things," she said. He stepped close and looked at the pump and the surrounding ground and then at her. "Good things or difficult things?" "Good things," she said. "Things that took a long time to arrive at being good." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with the unceremonious tenderness of a man who has been doing it for years and intends to keep doing it indefinitely, and said, "Your father would have been very proud." "I know," she said. "I feel it sometimes, standing here." She looked at the ground and then back at him. "Do you know what I thought that first afternoon you came down the road with the dowsing rod?" "Tell me," he said. "I thought, this man is either going to be the most useful person I have ever met or the most elaborate disappointment," she said. He laughed, the full, warm sound she had loved from the first time she heard it. "And the conclusion?" "Useful," she said. "Definitively and completely useful, and a great deal more than that." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him in the late afternoon light, and they stood together for a moment at the southeastern corner of the 40 acres that had been called Worthless Desert, listening to the wind and the sound of the pump and the distant lowing of the cattle on the north pasture, and the red mesas in the distance turned gold as the sun began its descent, the way they did at this hour, with the particular beauty of a thing that has always been there and has been looked at enough times that you know it the way you know a beloved face. In the summer of 1888, Thomas Turner, at 8 years old, found water on a neighboring property using his father's dowsing rod. He had gone out with Henry to help assess a potential well location for the Hartley family's ranch 2 miles north, and Henry had walked the ground carefully and identified 2 possible locations, and Thomas had asked to try, and Henry had handed him the rod without ceremony, and the boy had walked the same ground his father had walked and found a 3rd location, different from either of Henry's, and held the rod steady over it with the same white-knuckled certainty his father showed, and said, "Here. It is stronger here." Henry had looked at the spot and thought about it for a long time. Then he had said to old Mr. Hartley, who was watching with polite skepticism, "Drill here first." The Hartley well came in at 41 feet, the best water on the property, from precisely the location Thomas had indicated. Henry rode home that evening with his son in front of him on the roan horse, which was not the original roan but its offspring, a detail that the territory of time had accomplished, while no one was particularly attending to it. And Thomas was asleep against his father's chest before they reached the property gate, the rod still in his small hand. And Henry came through the gate in the dusk, and Virginia was on the porch, and he looked up at her with Thomas sleeping against him, and said, without preamble, "Our son is better at this than I am." Virginia looked at them in the failing light. "Tell me," she said, and he told her, and she listened with that complete quality of attention that had never changed. And when he finished, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "He pressed his hand against the ground when he found it, did he not?" Henry looked at her. "How did you know?" "It is what the ground knowers do," she said simply. And she came down the porch steps and took the sleeping boy from his father's arms and carried him inside. And Henry tied the horse and followed them into the warm lit house that smelled of supper and lamp oil, and the particular good smell of a place that is lived in fully. And he stood in the doorway of his son's room, watching Virginia settle the boy under the covers with the rod still loosely in his hand, which she left there without removing. Understanding that some things you do not take from people even in sleep. He came up behind her in the doorway, and she leaned back against him in the dark, and they stood together for a moment without speaking, listening to their son breathe. 2 years later, in the fall of 1890, Virginia and Henry stood on the same expanded porch of the same house and watched a territorial land surveyor, a young man not unlike Henry, had been a dozen years earlier ride down the road toward Cibola Flats in the direction of properties that needed measuring, and Thomas, who was 10, sat on the porch rail beside his father and asked about the survey instruments on the surveyor's pack horse with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered to him. Clara, at 7, was in the corral with Cruz's supervision, learning to put a proper saddle on her own horse, which she had been negotiating for since the age of 4, and had been given at 6, a steady bay mare named Delia, who was the most patient horse any of them had encountered, and who took Clara's learning process with a philosophical equanimity that made Henry say on multiple occasions that Delia should be teaching patience classes to the general population. The property around them on that fall morning was everything it had taken years to make it: the cattle in the north pasture, the horses in the corral, the garden putting out the last of the season's produce, the well pump in the southeastern corner standing solid in the morning light with the quiet permanence of something that has never failed, the red mesas on the horizon doing their daily work of turning gold and rose and ochre in the shifting sun. Virginia had a letter on her lap that she had been reading, from Elias Whitfield in Santa Fe, who had retired from active law practice the previous year, and was writing to let her know that the water cooperative documentation she had developed would be used as a model for a proposed territorial water rights framework being discussed in Santa Fe. That her 12-page proposal from 1882 had evolved through its various applied versions into something that land administrators were looking at as a template for how small landholders could collectively manage shared water resources without ceding individual rights. She had read the letter twice and said nothing about it to Henry yet, because she was sitting with the fact of it privately for a moment before she shared it, the way you hold something unexpected in both hands before you hand it to someone else. "What is the letter?" Henry said, because he read her silences as accurately as he read the ground. She handed it to him. He read it. She watched his face go through the same sequence hers had: comprehension, recalibration, a satisfaction that was too large for ordinary expression, and he looked up at her and said, "Virginia." "I know," she said. "Your father's land is referenced in this letter," he said. "The original case that demonstrated the principle. It says—" "I read it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the fall sunlight. Thomas had slipped off the porch rail and gone to investigate what his sister was doing with the saddle, and they were briefly alone in the way they sometimes were in the middle of ordinary life, a clearing between one thing and the next. "I am very proud of you," Henry said. "I have been proud of you every day since I came down that road with a piece of peach wood and a great deal of hope, but I am particularly proud of you today." Virginia looked at the red mesas. She looked at the pump in the southeastern corner. She looked at the letter in Henry's hand, and the house behind them, and the children at the corral, and the man beside her. "I am proud of us," she said. He reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers with the ease of 1,000 such gestures, and held it in that unceremonious way that was the truest thing she knew about him. Not ceremony or performance, but simply the direct, natural action of a man who wants to hold the hand of the person beside him, because she is the person he belongs beside, and has been since the afternoon he knelt beside her in the November light and found the water. Cibola Flats grew slowly through the 1880s and into the early 1890s. As the territory grew and more settlers came, and the railroad pushed its lines closer to the region, bringing trade and newspapers and new people, and the complex modernization that came with those things, the Turner Ranch remained what it had always been, a working, self-sustaining, modestly profitable piece of 40-plus acres on the edge of the mesas, with a reliable well and a good cattle operation, and people who understood the land they were on. Gerald Hatch had moved away from the county by 1885, his land company having gone through a series of financial reverses that the town attributed variously to overextension and to the general consequences of building a business on the dispossession of others, which tends toward instability. Virginia did not celebrate this and did not mourn it. She noted it as a fact and moved on. Augustus died in the spring of 1889, in his stable, peacefully, in the manner of a very old animal that has completed its business. Thomas, at 9, helped Henry dig the grave in the corner of the property near the stable, and Clara, at 5, placed a handful of spring flowers on the mounded earth with the solemn precision of a child who takes ceremony seriously. They stood together as a family for a moment at the small grave, and Henry said that Augustus had been a good mule and had done everything that was asked of him, and then some, which was the most any creature could be asked to do, and that the property would remember him. Virginia thought, standing at the grave in the spring morning with her family around her, about the mule that had carried her father's water barrels and his fencing supplies and his hope for 16 years, and she thought this was a good place to have ended, on this ground, with flowers on the grave. Life continued in its full, ordinary, extraordinary way. Thomas grew into a young man who combined his father's feel for the land with a precision and an intellectual range that led him, at 14, to begin corresponding with a geological survey office in Denver that had published a report on New Mexico aquifer systems, which Thomas had encountered in a Santa Fe periodical, and written to correct on a minor but significant point of fact. A correction the survey office acknowledged with genuine respect that made Henry look at the letter for a long time, and then set it down and say nothing for a moment, and then say, "He is going to need a better education than we can give him here." This was not a statement that sat easily with either of them, but they faced it with the same direct practicality with which they faced everything important. And by the time Thomas was 15, they had arranged for him to board with James Turner's family in Santa Fe during the school terms and attend the academy there, coming home to the ranch for summers and school holidays, which he did with evident pleasure, each return showing more of the person he was becoming: thoughtful, observant, passionate about the earth sciences, and deeply attached to the 40-plus acres that had made him. Clara stayed and thrived on the ranch with the full conviction of someone who has found exactly the right place, working alongside her parents and Cruz and Mateo with a practical intelligence and a physical capability that made her, by the time she was 14, an indispensable part of the daily operation. She had inherited her mother's precise organizational intelligence and her father's ability to read the land, expressed in her case as an exceptional aptitude for managing the cattle, for understanding the range conditions and the seasonal rhythms of the pasture, for knowing which animals to keep and which to sell, and when, and for what price. In the spring of 1895, Virginia was 40 years old and Henry was 44, and they sat on the covered porch in the warm April evening watching the last light leave the mesas, and the land around them was the fullest expression of what it had always been capable of being, given water and time and care. Thomas was home from Santa Fe for the Easter holiday, 23 now and in his final year of formal study, talking about a position with the United States Geological Survey that he had been offered and was considering, a position that would take him to other territories but whose base would remain in New Mexico, which meant he would be within a day's ride of the ranch on a regular basis. Clara was 16, managing the cattle books with a thoroughness that Whitfield's successor in Santa Fe had complimented on his recent visit, and making plans for a breeding program that she had written out in the same methodical document-based way her mother had always operated, a proposal that Henry had read with the same expression he had worn when he read Virginia's 12-page water cooperative proposal in 1882. Henry reached over in the warm April evening and took Virginia's hand in his, lacing his fingers through hers. 40 acres, he said. 60 now, she said, plus the water rights. That we were told was worthless desert, he said. That one man told us was worth finding, she said. He looked at her in the evening light with the same quality of attention he had brought to everything she had ever said to him, and with something additional that had accumulated over 17 years, a depth of knowing, a tenderness that was not separate from respect but the same thing expressed differently, an orientation toward her that was as natural and constant as the pull of the peach wood toward the hidden water. I would like to walk the perimeter tomorrow morning, he said, both of us, with the rod. We do that every spring, she said. I know, he said. I never want to stop. She looked at the mesas turning the last deep rose of the evening, and she heard from inside the house the sounds of Thomas talking and Clara answering with the particular cadence of siblings in genuine conversation, and she felt the ground solid under the porch boards, felt the water moving deep beneath it in its ancient steady way, felt the specific gravity of a life that was exactly what it was supposed to be. Neither do I, she said. In the morning they would walk the perimeter together, as they had done every spring since the first year, starting at the southeast corner by the pump, Henry carrying the smooth-worn dowsing rod that had been carried in 20 territories and across more dry miles than either of them could account for, Virginia walking beside him with her hand sometimes in his and sometimes free at her side, both of them paying the full quality of their attention to the ground beneath their feet. This specific 40 acres of New Mexico territory that had been called worthless desert and had turned out to be, like all things truly worth having, a matter of knowing where to look and having the patience to believe in what was there before you could see it. The sun would come up over the mesas and turn everything gold, and the pump would stand solid in the southeastern corner, and the water would be where it had always been, deep and cold and abundant, and Henry Turner would press his palm against the earth of his wife's father's land and feel it breathing, and Virginia Prescott Turner would stand beside him in the morning light of the territory she loved, and they would be exactly where they were supposed to be together, on the ground that had been waiting all along for someone to understand what it was worth, which turned out, as the best things always do, to be everything,